Thank you very much. In particular, I would like to thank our four speakers so far for being very disciplined about time, largely in order to make time for Jonathan Zittrain, who was a late but absolutely fantastic addition. I'm delighted to hand over the substantive role of sort of tying all of this together and guiding questions to him. I will, however, have to take 1 minute of your time at the very end. So as we approach the dreaded hour of 1 o'clock, if you could be absolutely dedicated and devoted to the conversation, that would be really good. And then at that last moment, absolutely dedicated to getting out of here with maximal elegance, that would be great. Jonathan is one of these people who I think needs no introduction, and I was polling people, does he need one or does he not? And a lot of people said, well, there's a lot of librarians here, so maybe he actually does. He's the co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, which has played an enormously important role in stimulating a broad range of discussions and debates at that level and in that forum, and also done some remarkable quantitative work of over the years. And he has a book out called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, which I believe was published by Yale University Press. Is that correct? I feel like I ought to plug it
As well
here.
as under a Creative Commons license, so I hope you just downloaded the PDF to your Kindle.
So anyway, enough of me. Jonathan, please. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I come to you without PowerPoint, so I feel digitally naked, but facing the daunting task of trying to give some big picture thoughts to what has been a lucid and fun and kaleidoscopic pair of panels this morning and discussions. So I'm so pleased to be here to be able to hear it and to try to share a few thoughts about it. So far, I think, Jessamine, I'm still processing your talk, but I think the best line of the day still goes to Ted with, here's where the Marxism comes in, bear with me. It's like, that's sort of what the Soviet Union really was, right? So, but we digress. So I first tried to think about some of these library issues at what I think of as a Library 1.0 meeting, and I'm not talking about the gathering at Ashurbanipal in 700 BC about clay tablet storage, but rather a meeting in 1999 sponsored by ARL and OCLC in Keystone, Colorado. It was a funereal event. On the comment cards, a lot of people were just talking about it was just too high, literally too high up and very dry. But there was a certain feeling, I think, that there's this odd combination of we're in the information economy, we know this is an information culture increasingly, and yet libraries are feeling irrelevant and tilting towards obsolescence. That was some of the feeling in 1999 against a backdrop of an internet culture of sort of reckless abandon. Rejection of any form of history or context. It was just go out. I mean, this was the time when a custodial products company simply renamed itself B2Becommerce.com and did an IPO, and I hope you didn't invest in that. Your stock may have died. It's worth thinking about the fact that Sergey Brin and Larry Page were graduate students at Stanford. They had some amazing insights about search, which directly led to them abandoning their studies and starting a .com. And I don't blame them one bit, right? Who could? But there is something about the relationship between some of these forces outside the Citadel and what's sort of inside our Citadel, the values we represent and what's going on that are worth reflecting on. And it makes me try to think about, well, what do I understand as an outsider to the library phenomenon, although just a click away within academia. What is the library? And in one sense, I suppose it's a noun. It's a pooling arrangement to deal with the problem of scarcity. Why not share a book around instead of having to have everybody buy a copy or go without? It's worth thinking on that front that the first sale doctrine, far more obscure than fair use, is truly a keystone that allows the library to exist. It's what says that even though it is quite likely costing the publishers money, and many of them, if they could deny you this right to buy a book and lend it in a kind of organized piracy scheme where people can put themselves on a list as to wanting the book next, and you can most efficiently, right, distribute it around. I mean, this is a form of taking money out of the authors' and publishers' pockets by one accounting, and yet the first sale doctrine allows us to do that. I suspect if the publishers could have killed it, they would, and then could decide whether to allow lending at their convenience. But that means that we end up with a big pile of collections that, especially due to the ethos of thoroughness and care and knowing that we are trying to save this stuff for thousands of years, the money that we have often goes into the preservation of these collections, even as they are in fact increasingly becoming archives, and maybe fewer and fewer people are finding need for them. And certainly after the Google Books settlement phenomenon works its way through one way or the other, it's even that much less likely that having a physical copy of the book will matter. There's certainly a paradox there too, because if the settlement had provided for utterly free books, let's just suppose the publishers had lost their minds for a moment and said, let's just make it free. Why not, Google? Thanks for scanning. We would probably cheer that on. I know it requires a bit of a mind bend, but we would cheer it on, but in a way it might put the basic noun function library out of business, because once it's free, why do you need to be warehousing them? And you might say, great, free at last, in both senses of the word, but it's also gets one to focus on exactly what is the mission and the relevance of it. Now, another mission that John Palfrey brought up this morning was library as a verb. The idea of not just having a big stack of stuff, whether digital or physical, but of the act of helping shepherd people through it. That's especially notable given his, I heard the gasp that got let out in the crowd as he shared this from his research, that all of the digital natives they were working with, when asked to look up the Spanish information about the Spanish Civil War, went to Google, 100% of them, Googled it, and then went to Wikipedia. And everybody's like, oh, that doesn't sound good. At least some of them should have gone to the library, which might have directed them to Google as a resource. And then I was thinking about it, and I was like, that's exactly what I would do if I wanted to research the Spanish Civil War. And, you know, who am I then to complain about it? The other notable thing that John said right in that couplet of observations was that 0 of the kids were moved to edit the wiki. And he was sort of just putting that out as, but eventually we'll get there kind of thing, but that shows the kind of work we have to be done. But I think that does demonstrate the difference between knowledge as a consumptive good, a term that appears frighteningly frequently in the Google Books settlement agreement, a consumptive use of the knowledge, which makes me think, like, is the knowledge gone after you consume it? What comes out the other end? We call that scholarship. But it raises the question of who owns the phenomenon, say, of Wikipedia, and can you encourage the patrons, or the kids if they're in class, to imagine owning it in some way, having it actually be something that they identify with and are part of. And I study internet governance in the future and past of the internet, and that's the question that the internet raises for us. Do we think of the internet as a shared participatory phenomenon, given its invitation to us to build upon it without any gatekeepers? It's that invitation that has seen, usually from left field, most of the advances that we then accept as reality and try to incorporate into what we're doing that come about. So a guy named Brewster decides to start archiving the web, because someone ought to do it. I mean, we might want the web at some point from the past. And just starts doing it. Now, I don't think it should come as a surprise, and I mean, I'd be interested to hear different judgments here. The Internet Archive may well be, before the Google Books project, one of the largest infringements of copyright in the world. Now, I say that sort of advisedly because I love the Internet Archive. We all love the Internet Archive. When you ask Brewster this kind of question, which I did, he kindly participated in a class of mine a couple years ago, he's like, well, you know, when people call with a problem, we take stuff out. I mean, it's like he works it out, which is an amazing human way to provide what is now an essential function, a utility of the Internet, and one that, did it not occur to the more institutional pieces of this landscape to do it? Was it a money issue? What was it that made it that a guy would come forward to do it and who's done it so well, rather than that we see it as so central to what institutionally in academia we're doing? The examples, other examples abound. Project Gutenberg, right? Michael Hart is just like, let's start typing in public domain books. We'll get volunteers to type in books. Now, this is like a crazy and beautiful idea, and Michael Hart is still doing it, right? And just, you know, when he's not typing books, he's lengthening his SIG file, which is, has a number of instructions and quotes and how to communicate with him. Quirky, but also one of the central features. I think of that with Steve Schultz's and others' Hacking Pacer project. Maybe with the Cornell LII taking up the project of just trying to get simple, ad-free access to the nation's statutes and later cases. And yes, Wikipedia is an example of this, and the Google Book Scanning project. And one of the most notable things, Jeff Cunard, who you'll hear from later today, was a guest in my class last week. And one of the things he said was, sort of, he'll no doubt correct this, but it was sort of like, you got to hand it to the Google guys. Like, they were just bold enough to start scanning big piles of books and then get sued and basically go for double or nothing, right? The lawsuit is about their use, which is to produce snippets of these copyrighted books out to the user, and the lawsuit comes out, and what do they end up with but a class action settlement that will allow the full text to be offered on terms that we're still talking about that favor Google. But wow, that is a level of boldness that we don't often see, I think, emanating institutionally from academia. Same with Amazon taking up the Kindle and setting up the structures that Ted was talking about, or even setting up search. Now, there are opportunities here, I think, for us to be players, not just reactive. And I keep thinking, why are we so reactive in academia? Reactive isn't always bad. It's the reactiveness that has us sometimes on the front lines challenging the Patriot Act provisions by which you might be asked for patron data and not even allowed to consult a lawyer about it. Or the EPA story that we heard from Mary Alice about pushing back against things that we know are wrong. But it also means that we miss out on opportunities to do something larger. And I think, this is just hypothesis, there's just a level of carefulness about what we do. Sometimes we make the perfect the enemy of the good. And unless we feel we can do something completely right from soup to nuts, we need the entire Dewey Decimal System before we have a little bit of folksonomy about us. That means that we end up not quite getting there. And we have a lot of organizations that try to pull us together, but that start overarching projects that never quite get finished. I think of like the Gaudi Cathedral not to be confused with the Gaudi Cathedral, the Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona, that's just this wonderful work that never quite made it out. An example of that quickly was, I was wondering as a researcher, I want to be able, when I visit a link and later want to cite to the page I found at the end of the link, I want to be able to push a button and have it archived in a library. So if there's any question later, it's like, there it is, there's the page. It's kind of an ancillary function that the Internet Archive could be serving. And I was asking the Harvard Law librarians why we just don't go out and build it. And they said, well, there's actually a Harvard University project called WAX. Need an ad man for that. The Web Archive Project, right? Acronym, WAX. And yet, to do it, you have to sign up, you have to get a buddy in the library system, you have to pay. I mean, it's great, but totally non-functional for the casual user, and most people are that. So I think the lessons I draw from this are, money can go a long way. I know we're always short of it, but you know, can't we get an earmark or something in the context of $1 trillion bailout here or a $9 billion farm bill there? What did it cost to scan those books? Somewhere between $100 and $300 million, I'm told. Now, on one hand, that's a lot of money. On the other hand, by 1999 statistics, shopping cart theft annually in the United States was $800 million. So just like 1/8 of the shopping carts that disappear could fund the provision of scanning books in a sense where we could actually take that on. Now, why aren't we probably going to do that? One is because, well, now Google's done it. Who wants to scan them all over again? And you were all like, I hope the books come back safe and sound after they go off to be treated like a sausage factory in the scanning zone. But we do have these gold copies. And when I think about the Google Books settlement, I'm not going to go at length on it, but these so-called LDCs, library digital copies, that come out of that settlement, there's some real possibilities there As you might guess, my read of the terms of the settlement is not being that generous with what libraries can do with those digital copies. People have been telling you about the 17-page security guidelines, and it's almost safer just to bury it like radioactive waste that can hurt you rather than try to make something of it. And when I see terms in the agreement that say things like, qualified users can access protected material. How's that for humankind's knowledge? It's protected material. To perform computational analysis on the corpus, the research corpus, but not to understand the intellectual content of the book. Now, not all books assist with that project anyway, but it's an agreement drafted by lawyers and business people, not one where the libraries have really had a seat at the table. And I do think there are things we can do to try to assert ourselves here. And we've seen leadership from people like Ann Wolpert and others who have been thinking through these open access issues so much. So when I think about what is the library really, what do we know it is? We know it's a set of values sometimes reflected with the quirky people who have stepped forward. And by quirky, that sounds pejorative. We know it's not. The web is quirky. The internet is quirky, right? And yet central. These values need to be defended and fought for and inculcated into our young academics and our students, whether it's K through 12 or higher ed, and see that the spirit that lives on a little bit in the wiki, in Gutenberg, in the Internet Archive, can be reflected in what we do and really make us at the table trying to build on this internet, even though we know it's going to cost money and time, and there is so much else to do in the meantime. Speaking of time, it is short, so I'm going to wrap with that and use the remaining time we have. I know I've been asked to help moderate some questions for the panel, so I'll say thank you very much. So I guess we should see if there are people who want to step up to, is it that microphone? Are there any others? And give us a quick question, provocation, anything else? And we have exactly 7 minutes. So this is like the last act of an episode of 24, right? The bomb is ticking. Can you defuse it? I know, everybody's like scared. Nobody wants to say that. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I think this question would be to Mr. Zimmer, please, or the whole panel. In light of increased access to all this technology, with viruses and techno-anarchy, what security measures are being taken to prevent criminal penetration of identity theft, sensitive information, confidential information, in other areas?
Thanks. Well, unfortunately, I'm not an information security expert, and I have a hard time keeping my browser safe at times as well. I think one of the main things that have been done historically in terms of the collection of any kind of personal data is an attempt to anonymize that information. We hear that talked a lot more in terms of search engine query data. Attempts to strip out IP addresses, strip out any kind of, quote, personally identifiable information. Increasingly, that's becoming problematic. Attempts to do that, and the way even that how data laws here in the US can sort of frame what is personally identifiable is quite limited. I mean, my name, my social security number, sure is personally identifiable. But if you looked at everything I've searched in the last week, you'd probably also figure out who I am, even if my name's not in there. And the AOL search data release sort of helped bring that home, that you can just look at people's search queries and identify them. So attempts to anonymize data or just drop bits off of an IP address is what's commonly being done, but it's often insufficient. In terms of actual repositories, there's various methods of encryption and ways that you can create data security within your systems, and that can really speak to the accuracy of that. It's an increasing challenge. Just a final example, Netflix data set. People that use Netflix understand you can create the queue that you want. You can rate things. You can say, I like this, I don't like that. The company released that data in an anonymous form to try to spur innovation among researchers to build a better algorithm. Within about a week, some scientist was able to re-identify all that information by mapping that on top of people's activity on IMDb. And you start mapping social networks on top of each other, and you can re-identify quite easily. So the concern that you're bringing is an important one, and unfortunately some of the solutions we have work only to a certain extent, and there's a lot of really smart people in computer science working on these problems to try to find better ways to secure this information.
Of course, what I heard you saying, Michael, in your presentation was that that shouldn't deter the library community from doing things that might well entail collection of data not previously collected, but that you just got to be careful with standards, both security and privacy, and maybe even set an example so that you could ask a company, not just are you ANSI certified for your data security, but are you up to the library level of protection for your data?
Right.
And maybe that can scare them into,
Right.
yeah.
That's one of the examples when we talk about building widgets or building different kinds of applications. Because so many of these tools are built around an advertising framework, can we leverage these companies to build us a version of this software where I'm not automatically collecting this data, and that becomes sort of this gold standard, the librarian
Yeah,
standard.
yeah. And I know, Ted, one of your big worries about Kindle is not just the money you pay and the way in which the stuff might get locked up, but in that data that gets generated.
Right. No, I mean, part of the talk that I wasn't able to kind of present on time constraints was, the way in which all of that material gets archived, and, who knows what will happen. I mean, it's interesting to think about Amazon's solvency now. I mean, they are doing reasonably well. They posted a profit when lots of other retailers weren't posting a
I mean, if
profit.
they should get bought by the GRU, would they? Yeah.
Exactly. But what happens, if those issues that they were having financially at the early part of their days, reassert themselves, and they have to go bankrupt? What happens to all of that data in its sort of digital afterlife, if they decided to sell it off? Who ends up owning how you read?
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to speak to that
Jessamine.
from our teeny perspective. Is one of the Library 2.0 quandaries that we deal with really in sort of small town library world is enabling this stuff. We're not building these tools ourselves. We're using other people's tools. That's fine. I'm comfortable with other people's tools, but it's not only what they're doing with their data, which is mysterious, and I think they have a vested interest in keeping that mysterious. Why would they tell me what they're doing with my data? I would say I didn't want to give it to them. But what's also happening is our users and the people who run our libraries aren't sophisticated at a technical enough level to even understand, the anonymizing features of Firefox, and so you have to have people who know enough to know what you can do with data. I mean, you guys are all talking about, anonymizing data, and we all say the AOL thing, and everyone's like, oh yeah, because I search my own address and then you know who I am. But explaining that to people who their computer is for work and they don't use it at home. And so number one, I mean, our library privacy issues are focused more around, can we email a patron their overdue notices because people in Vermont share email addresses? And it's a totally different thing. I mean, my library, we write down our names in the back of the book. We're not gonna next year, but
And
we
does it
now.
feel a little bit absurdist that is, I mean, on one hand, it's a totally genuine worry. On the other, given the mountain of stuff that in the other spheres of your patrons' lives they are exposing and sharing, it almost seems like a teaspoon in the ocean,
And
doesn't
that's
it?
our core values versus everybody else's
Yeah.
core values, and that's what, to me, makes a library and not, the bookstore where you can actually sit and read.
And are the patrons buying what you're selling? When you say that, are they like, hell's yeah?
Oh, they buy what I'm selling, yeah.
Uh-huh. Got it. Michael, you wanted the last word.
Oh, the last word. Well, I have many last words. But this point that we're bringing up in terms, especially when we make that comparison to what is Amazon doing with the data, I mean, I think this is the real opportunity for libraries to stand up and say, even if we're collecting this information, let's be transparent. Let's give access. Google actually made an important step in this direction when they announced their behavioral targeting scheme a few weeks ago. That to a very, 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 very limited extent, you can click through and see what they're collecting about you and how they're profiling you and make edits to that. I'd like to see that at the minute detail level. If we're going to have a recommendation system, Amazon has all this amazing data about me. I don't get to see any of it. If Milwaukee Public Library wants to collect that data about me, let me look at it. Let me delete information from it. Let me correct it. Let me sort of fudge it if I wanted to fudge it.
Which almost makes it sound, again, pointing towards the Google Books discussion that's going to take place.
Right.
That may be a real opportunity as a single Books Rights Registry is going to be created that's going to interact with Google. You've got this database stuff getting tracked. Maybe there is some role for external involvement in the public interest to make sure that those things are respected. Ted, you have an important secret announcement that can now be unveiled for the minute for which everybody must pay close attention.
Fantastic. I feel like I'm on The Price is Right, except that I was already up here. During the lunch break, there will be 3 birds of a feather meetings. There will be one on privacy that's being hosted or attracted by Michael Zimmer over here. There's another one on PACER and surrounding issues, again being sort of attracted by Mary Alice. Oh, sorry. There's a second one on PACER that Mary Alice and Stephen Schmitz will be hosting, and a third one on the Google Book settlement by Emma Lanso.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks
Thank you
for a
very
great
much
morning.
to our guests. And now,